Hello, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. I've realised these intros are too long, so I'm going to shorten them. All I'm going to say is today we're talking about Park McArthur, the American artist. We're talking about her in terms of sculpture, but she produces lots of different kinds of work. And we are focusing on a 2015 text by Andrew Blackley about Park McArthur's work called Geometry, Material, Scale. We look at the foreword to Lucy Lippards' 6 Years, the Dematerialization of the Art Object, which is a book about conceptual art. We look at a Park McArthur interview from Bomb magazine, and we also look at a text by Park McArthur called Sort of Like a Hug, Notes on Collectivity. As per usual, you can download these texts from dekersaint.com/Bad Vibes Club. That's dekersaint.com/Bad Vibes Club. I'm going to let me and Andrea do the rest of the speaking because we do a pretty good job of introducing Park McArthur's work. But it's a really good episode, and obviously Park McArthur is a contemporary sculptor still making work now, and so it's dealing with issues around how to read around an artist's work who's, not been totally historicised. All right, enjoy the episode and I'll see you at the end. So today we're going to look at Park McArthur, who is an American artist. We're going to look at 3 texts. Is that right? Is that the amount that we're going to put up?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And what are those texts, Andrea, if you have them to hand?
So this was interesting because I think we found it really hard to find text about McCarthur and just like maybe being more aware of trying to talk more and more about how, we find these texts and how we can like use them and open up the research and reading infrastructure of the podcast. So we are going to do one text from Park McArthur, but when she writes, is usually about, or is always about care practices. So she doesn't really talk about her sculptures in her writing. So we're going to read Sort of Like a Hug, Notes on Collectivity, Conviviality and Care, that was published on the Hypocrite, and it was edited by Isla Liver-Yap. And then we found one text about McArthur's work on Afterall magazine, and that's called Park McArthur, Geometry, Material, Scale by Andrew Blackley. And we're going to do an interview, which I think you'll let me choose in the end what interview we're going to use. And I would like to do the one on Bomb magazine by Jennifer Burris, who is the person who co-wrote the Beverly Buchanan text that we read last time with Park McArthur. So there's like a direct connection between this episode and the last episode, since the little kind of leaflet sort of book about Beverly Buchanan that we read was written by Park McArthur and Jennifer Burris.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe representative of, Park McArthur's a contemporary sculptor. She's working now, like she's relatively young, has not had a bazillion solo shows or anything. And it speaks to the complexity of people's practices now, that it was kind of harder to find one text that summed up her practice or that took her oeuvre in as a whole or something, or interpreted it in one way. And it may be, and maybe there's something else to be said, and we might disagree on this, whether it's kind of symptomatic of the way that art is being thought about at the moment, that it's actually quite hard to find writing that directly deals with the sculptural forms that McArthur produces. But the Afterall piece does, and actually there's moments in the Bomb interview as well that kind of do deal with that. But it's so intricately connected to other parts of McArthur's work and research that it kind of can't be split off in the way that maybe, I don't know, even with Felida Barlow, we could in quotation marks just talk about the work. And yeah, what that means to just talk about the work is obviously complex.
I think McCarthur considers her writing on care as part of her work. So it's not that it's hard to find these things that are about the work, but it's like, but it's that practices that are not placed anymore. Like your practice, like you're a sculptor, but you're also like a lot of other things. So it's hard to find something that can like focus on that specific, like that sees those divisions in the thinking of how something is analyzed.
Yeah, definitely. And again, if we're thinking about this podcast as about text and about reading and about, something about students who are looking into these things, it can be frustrating when you're looking at the work of a artist who works in many different ways or takes on subject matter in multiple different ways or or has multiple thematics or whatever, that sometimes, the text that you can access is not necessarily directly about the thing that you think is connected to your practice. So I suppose it's about how to read through and with text and think alongside them, as well as, extracting information from them or something like that. So that's what I guess we'll be trying to do today as well, is trying to think about sculpture, but with Park McArthur's interests in care, collectivity, access, all of these other things. Any other keywords you think might come up?
Like a non-universalist idea of the public and the viewer. I think that's what I really like about, and I don't have like a specific like term for it, like something about refusal or neutrality. I think is the thing that I find most interesting in her work, and as a concept to think about sculpture and fine art in general, like the refusal of the idea that there is one ideal viewer that is just the same and neutral and kind of like dictates everything in this kind of imaginary public, that you do work for everyone. And I think, and McCarthur would agree with me, you never make work for everyone. Like if you think you're making work for everyone, then you're already like excluding lots of people without, in a kind of thoughtless way.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, maybe we should explain that we also both read the preface and intro to Lucy Lippards' book on conceptual art, 6 years, the dematerialization of the art object. Is that? I think that's
the
right
longest title. I don't.
It's got a crazy long title, hasn't it? I'm not going to say it all. Do you want to read it out? Have you got it?
I got it. Oh no, I don't got it. I haven't got it. Sorry.
Okay, let's not worry about it, because it's like 100 words long or something, isn't it? And that's important to think about, is that we're thinking about sculpture in relation to conceptual practice and maybe first and second wave institutional critique. So I guess we can get into that a bit later. So it's basically, there's a lot going on in this episode, and there's a lot going on in McCarthur's work. So where should we start? I feel like this is I'm going to hand the reins over to you, Andrea, because I really don't know where to start.
I think, I wanted to start by saying that I'm having like a massive crash and fatigue, and it just feels so appropriate. Because so I have a post-viral illness, and I just pushed myself too much in the last few weeks. So I'm having like massive like brain fog and derealization. I had to like reread these texts like 5 different times to remember what they were about. And I think it's interesting to make that visible, because I think one is kind of like directly related to what McCarthur is interesting, which is like making these kind of like infrastructures of social reproduction and kind of like access visible. But also I was thinking about it in terms of students, because I think more and more, again, we live in like a post-COVID world. We live in a world in which a lot of people are living into really, really high pressure. So I have a lot of students that have like mental health issues. I also have a lot of students that have like different types of disabilities that kind of like influence their relation to the text and their time and all these different things. And I think this definitely will affect the way that I relate to the text today. But I think it's also important to students to know that is part of how you live in the world. And I think like Park McArthur would say that. And how can you let that affect your reading and work with it, or be aware of kind of like the different pressures that are being put on you, or you're just like allowing that to be visible. So I just wanted to say that. Let's
give some really basic contextual information then. So Park McArthur is a wheelchair user. She mentions in various texts that she has some kind of muscular dystrophy. She doesn't say what kind. You can kind of read about her relationship to her health condition. So she's a wheelchair user. So, and one of the things we decided was that we would focus on one exhibition she had at Essex Street in New York in 2014, which is called
Ramps.
Is it called Ramps? Yeah, it's called Ramps. Yeah. So sorry, I just thought I'd mention that, just because obviously.
No, that's good.
So what were you going to say next before we?
I was going to go back to, because you mentioned Lippard, I was going to go back to one of the things that I found interesting is we're starting, we were trying to we decided we wanted to talk about Park McArthur because I had this memory. So I've seen the kind of like the reiteration of Ramps. So she did Cheese and Hale a year after in London. And I actually didn't get it at all. Like I didn't have any context or like understanding of what's going on. But then a few years ago, I was in Bergen and McCarthur was part of this group show, and she had this amazing work. So she does a lot of sound pieces as part of her sculpture practice. and she has this amazing exhibition in this room. And what she had done is she had put the speakers at the height for a wheelchair user. So the only people that will have like the ideal perception or like confrontation with the work will be people in wheelchair. And you were made aware that you couldn't access, you have to like move or position yourself, that the work wasn't meant for you. And when we're thinking about this series of text and sculpture, we're thinking about, organizing each episode about like one way to think about sculpture. Like I immediately thought about that work because I thought that work did something really interesting and very different from all the works that we've been doing so far. So that's when we kind of like, and then we started looking at all these different texts and not finding things. And again, like there's not like a book that we can find. So we could just finding like different, like small short pieces in magazines and weren't really satisfied. And then you said something that I thought was really brilliant. You just texted me one day and you were like, I got it. It's like, we can't talk about Park McArthur without talking about conceptualism. We set ourselves sort of a trap in this podcast because we kind of like chose this history of like minimalism and this way of thinking about sculpture. And we kind of like have like repeated this very direct genealogy that just comes straight through. And we kind of like completely ignore this other way of thinking about sculpture. And now we kind of like, we reach this point in sculpture where we just can't think about Park McArthur using only the tools from like minimalism and the expanded field and all these different things that we've been looking at. We need to like go back and find this different frame. And I thought that was really interesting. It kind of had to like dismantle some things that I had been building in my head for the past 6 episodes. And kind of had to like rethink it. And I thought there's something really interesting about a work that it is, when you think about ramps, and again, there's like a clearly like minimal influence in the way the objects are into space. Like they're on the floor, they have this serial aspect to them. There's like these industrial materials in the floor of the gallery occupying the space. You can think about like, Walter de Maria. There's all these ways in which it touches with our history, but it also like refers to this outside world around those objects that I think we haven't really talked that much so far. And it does it in a very different way. I just work with my students with using the first episode, and as I went back into like Duchamp mode, and I was like, it's also not the ready-made from Duchamp way to relate to the outside world. It's something else. And I think maybe that it's quite insightful into like, this is the way to kind of like get into that practice.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely has, we should definitely talk about the relationship. I think Park McArthur is working with ready-mades in this Ramps show. But yeah, it's just a very, very different relationship between the artist and the object than Duchamp's disinterested, like flaneur-y, like wandering around having a look at some cool stuff. Because so the exhibition is, I can't remember how many ramps, but a load of ramps that were all built or purchased between 2010 and 2013, primarily made or purchased for use by Park McArthur to get in and out of buildings. So they're mostly from art spaces, art schools, galleries.
Some of them are from her building. So places that she used. They're places that she has a relationship to. So the ramps have all been built for her. That's the key point.
And some of them are, like fancy fold-up metal ramps that are like, probably cost quite a lot of money. And like one of them is literally a broken bit of chipboard. And they all have individual names, which I think is interesting. Like the exhibition is called Ramps, but the works are all the individual ramps and they're descriptive titles. So it's like Essex Street blue ramp with a date from when it was constructed. So this notion that, that is a kind of ready-made thing. She's like appropriating the moment where they were bought or produced or used for her as the moment of creation of this sculptural object. And they all look different, but of course they're assembled in this conceptual art way of kind of almost like being laid out on the floor, not quite a grid. I guess it is a non-standard grid. Or they're all in 90-degree relation to each other. So it becomes this, we're reading them in serial or we're reading them and comparing them to each other. So it has a kind of internal relationship. But it's really nice, the idea that they're named as individual sculptures. I thought that was quite funny and quite, does complexify the relationship to conceptual art. Which text could we start with?
Maybe the Afterall, because that has more like a descriptive narrative of the practice, I guess.
Yeah, this is the text that gives all the names of the individual sculptures. So Recess 2012, brackets brown with tape, Denny Gallery, 2013, brackets white. Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, large, 2012. Whitney Independent Study Program, 2013. Blonde, metal, pink, warped, partially gone, like all these descriptive terms that kind of maybe describe the relationship or the institution in some way, like the institution's ability and funding and architecture that allows it or doesn't allow it, or to get, to buy a ramp or to have to use a bit of wood to get Park McArthur into the building. I thought that was really nice. The other element of that work is that these ramps were taken away from, the location where they were originally used to install it in Essex Street Gallery. And then at the site from which the ramp was removed, each of those places posted a sign in a kind of official sign that says ramp access located at Essex Street, which in a footnote, the writer says, this could be read as a gesture of courtesy, although it is also a legal requirement. Since 12th of October 2012, New York City law requires inaccessible buildings to give instructions as to the nearest available accessible entrance or facility. So that's where this kind of institutional critique comes in, where the work is not just to be looked at and considered, in relation to itself, but in relation to the institution that it's sat in, and then in relation to all of these other institutions and the institution of disability law and accessibility, notions of accessibility. So there's a lot of relationships going on in the work. And I guess one of my questions about this, this is something. One of my questions about this is, can all those relationships be thought of using the idea of sculpture, or do we have to step out of sculpture to start to to make sense of this work?
It's interesting because I think there's a point in the Afterall that has like this. It's talking about ramps, and it's talking about this other project of McCarthur, which is called Carried and Held, which is this gigantic list of names which should register everybody that has to like carry her, to reposition herself, as part of this, she like registering this kind of collective care that she is dependent on to survive. And the Afterall piece says, as with the names listed in Carried and Held, each of the sculptural objects in ramp visualize an interpersonal geometry. And I thought that was really interesting because that's a sculptural way to think about. So like this list of names is quite different in a piece that would be, I guess you have like lots of conceptual art that are about writing, that are just about kind of the sequence of things. But I think in McCarthur's word, those sort of references are always infrastructural references, that like they're referencing like an infrastructure of social reproduction that exists in the world, and that is something that has dimension. It has a sculptural quality to it, I think, I would say. Yeah,
I really agree. I thought, and actually this takes us across to her sort of like a hug essay for The Happy Hypocrite, which is about collective care. And she says a really nice thing, which says, the relational events we make between Park McArthur and the people who care for her, the relational events we make cross and recross divides of nakedness and coverage, emotional closeness and reticence, attention and bored inattention, manifesting as actions that look like embracing, making dinner, drinking alcohol, cutting hair, falling asleep, reading poems and essays, watching YouTube videos, massaging limbs, recounting stories. These activities ornament the basic goals of showering, changing into pajamas and getting into bed. My own interest in these acts of relating scale disparate spatial and temporal registers, from the shapes our bodies make during a lift and transfer to the alternative commitments we decline in order to meet at the same time and place. So there's definitely something sculptural about that. But a refusal to break apart the sculptural and the spatial and the temporal there as well, right? So it's not just about the shapes that their bodies make. It's also about, the social commitments that they decline in order to, carry out the care or to be with each other in that time. So I think there's definitely something there in terms of she both embraces the sculptural as a way to think about all of these things, but also refuses to kind of cut it off from lots of other dimensions.
And I was thinking about, again, like the expanded field, because the more the time passes, the more I dislike that text. But there's something in in Park McArthur, which is kind of the objects or the, you know, the sculptural objects that she places, and some of them are you know, quite objects that have no manipulation at all, so they are kind of ready-mades. They are always already part of this larger structure. Like there's a way in which her work sort of makes visible how impossible or how like absurd it is that we think about these objects as isolated objects, which is my normal relation to sculpture in a sense, just to look at the thing that is in front of me. And I think McCarthur is proposing something else, is that object is always already, you know, carries all this different, you know, maintenance and labor for it to be there, for it to be sustained, that it has a history. And it's super interesting because it's also completely different from the remains energy aspect of it. It's like a different way of thinking. I think it's about relationality in a sense. It's kind of like how we're trained to ignore relationality, and she just makes relationality like so visible that if you go and you just look at, like I did with ramps, and you go and you don't read the text, you don't know what that is about, and you just look at the objects, it's just silly. It just makes me feel silly for that, but then it just also makes me feel silly about sometimes the way that I look at other sculptures, because there's so much work in the art institution to make you forget those things, in a sense, that's the art pure object, the object that is just in itself. And I think she's doing something really interesting about, and it has to, and then it kind of like makes sense of her writing on care and things, because she's talking about the human in the same way that we're kind of like used to think about the human without dependencies, and that doesn't make any sense.
But the one thing I would say about that, and I this isn't a critique, well, this is not a criticism at all, but it's interesting that McCarthur makes use of, you know, the white cube gallery space so much. I'm just looking at images of the Chisenhale show. You know, she's using plinths, you know, white plinths for some of those works. So to get you to think about how all of these objects are always already connected to everything else, she still uses those kind of mounting or framing devices that we associate with the fantasy of the autonomous art object or something. So, you know, ramps, in a way, I agree, you wouldn't get that much from it if you didn't spend a bit of time and give it a certain kind of attention, reading the text, getting to know the work. But at the same time, you know, it's definitely a physically imposing installation. It takes up most of the floor space. So it is thinking about, you know, notions of sculpture that we have thought about in terms of post-minimalist work. You know, it blocks space, it covers the floor, it spreads out horizontally, and it asks you to, it like forces you to relate to it rather than, you know, just being kind of present for you to look at. But yeah, I think there is something about attention there, right? Is that if you just focused on the physical manifestation of her work, then you would be missing an important component, which is what makes it conceptual, small c conceptual art, or at least influenced by conceptual art.
That's also part of what made her work a sculpture in a way, and kind of like connected to institutional critique, is that she's like inside the institution, and she's playing with the kind of like the rules of the art as an institution, not only the art institutions, but art as a thing. So, you know, this is not a social practice artist, because for the Chisenhale, so she has these plinths, and then on top of the plinths she has these kind of boxes that have different materials and are cataloged in different ways. So you have like different plinths with different kind of like open boxes, and these boxes have different sort of materials and objects that touch the skin. So it will be like gaze to cover wounds, or it will be, and they can be taken away. So it's also like a reference for like a history in the arts of like conceptual and activist art that has a different, I don't know, consumption or like relationship with the viewer, where you can take things and they can refill by the gallery. So it's like all of her work kind of like references art history in a sense. Always.
Yeah, she's referencing Felix Gonzalez Torres with his like mounds of sweets that can be taken away.
Yeah, and Ramps is like a direct reference to this other work, right? Which I
found it, yeah. So just to, you know, we were talking about how she wrote this little thing about Beverly Buchanan, and in their Bomb interview, the interviewer asks, is Beverly's sculptural strategy something you were thinking about when making Ramps? And Park McArthur says, not really. For this show, I was thinking a lot about John Knight's 1998 exhibition at American Fine Arts titled Identity Capital. So it's quite a complex work. It's a second wave institutional critique work. It says, John Knight And Colin Deland went around to different Soho restaurants where after art events often happened, and Knight asked these businesses to donate their floral arrangements to the gallery. In substitution for these floral arrangements, a card was placed in the restaurants that announced the show. The flower arrangements were then placed on the floor of the gallery with a checklist of where they were all from. So it's a really, really direct, maybe not quite, it's not a remake or anything, but it's a really, really direct reference, isn't it? But where John Knight's piece is about a kind of universal the wrong way, a really kind of art worldy idea of what the gallery, of how to, I don't know, what I'm trying to get to is, I think back to your original idea that Park McArthur refuses universality in such a way that it makes that universality look a bit silly or or something. And that kind of, I was doing a lot of looking at Andrea Fraser's institutional critique around the end of the 90s, and she's got a similar vibe in the sense that sometimes it feels like a very general critique of the art world that's also hyper specific to, like having worked in New York for a long time or something like that. And this is definitely this kind of like very insidery version of what institutional critique is, but without noticing that it's very insidery. Whereas McCarthy's is very, very specific to her particular position as an artist who has to use a wheelchair to go in and out of galleries. There's no danger of it being mistaken for anything other than a very particular artist's critical appreciation of the art world in which she operates.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good point to go back to Lucy Lippards' prologue in the book. So it's the 2010 prologue, which is amazing. It's one of the best texts I read in ages. I think that's what made me more annoyed at Rosalind Krauss, because I realized that Lippards actually a bit older than Krauss, and they're writing about the same time, and Lippard just has the most generous and uncertain way of writing, I think. Things which I so much more intellectually aligned to. I find it like a much harder way to write, but I find it like a much more interesting way to write. And she has this sentence on it. And again, when we're like doing this research, we're like, well, how are we going to talk about this work? And you said that thing about conceptual art, and I went back to Lippard, and I found this. I thought, oh my God, this is the thing. This is what her work does. And is this bit when she says, I lost the exact quote, but she says that conceptual artists were it was interesting because they were like so focused in distribution, but they didn't really thought about access at all, and they were so focused on communication, they were not focused in community. And I thought it was super interesting in the way that those are the two things that McCarthur addresses in her work.
Yeah. Oh, let's find the quote, because that is a good quote.
There's the beginning of a paragraph is communication but not community, and distribution but not accessibility were inherent in conceptual art. Although the forms pointed towards democratic outreach, the content did not. However rebellious the escape attempts, most of the work remained art referential, and neither economic or aesthetic ties to the art world were fully severed. Though at times we like to think they were hanging by a thread.
Yeah, it's really nice that. And it does point to how insular the art world was. We did talk about that last time with the Contextures essay written by Linda Goodbryant, and oh my God, every damn time I just cannot remember the other person's name.
Me neither. So
okay, but Linda Goodbryant ran this gallery just above Midtown, which represented lots of artists who weren't kind of seen by, mainstream art. And I think that it's something crazy, like they were literally 2 streets away from MoMA or something like that. And yeah, like they were never written about. They're just not in Rosalind Krauss's essay about American art in the 60s and 70s. And Linda Goodbryant makes the case for this idea of contextures, this notion of art that is abstract but also takes in material and ideas from its social or political context. And I suppose that's, Lippard says in that 6 Years book that conceptual art can only really be considered political in a very, very minor way, because it was taking place at the same time as like very, very radical political things like feminism, it's all happening in the 60s, like huge kind of revolutionary, the anti-Vietnam kind of project, anti-Vietnam War protests and things like that. And conceptual art's doing these very minor things. And she says it's only really political in its form. And yeah, the content kind of remains quite unradical, maybe not conservative, but not radical. And I suppose, yeah, to think about Park McArthur in relation to conceptual art is to think about how she kind of reaches outside of art to then think back on the art world or art institutions or something. What about the sort of like a hug piece?
It's funny because, so this is the first thing that I read from Paul McArthur, and I read it after I went to the She's in Hell exhibition, and I didn't get it. And then a friend was just like, well, you need to like read her stuff. So I read it ages ago, and I just really loved it. And I kind of loved it again. I was like looking at it and just thinking of so many students that would love it as an example of someone who's looking at their own experience and is writing about it in this kind of really generous and thoughtful way, and also critical way that is not enamored of the self in some way. There's something really like social about the writing. They had this beautiful postscript at the end when she's just writing about the process of writing and rewriting, and she's like, well, she has by this point she has rewritten it 3 times, and then she's like talking about the different people that talked to her about the essay and why she changed it. And she has this one thing, which again is the same thing that Lippard has as a quality, which is this constant negation of universality and neutrality. So, and it comes in her work, and it comes in her thinking, and here it comes in her drafting. And she's like, though such processes of editing and re-editing and whole making, there is also everywhere the presence of patch makers and their patches. I rewrote and rewrite these texts as I learned things. The patch makers became my teachers. The teachers being people I know and don't know. The lessons being a casual comment, a serious conversation, a decision to continue or not continue participating in car collective, the social movements for care and labor justice at large. It's very similar to Lippard's writing in a sense, but this idea that there will never be a perfect text. There will never be something that covers everything. You're always ignoring things to be able to see other things. You're always like excluding people to be able to include other people. That's one of the things that she talks about care and dependence is like, it's always going to be asymmetrical. Things are always asymmetrical. It's just really interesting to me that she managed to have that quality in her writing as well. I find it like a really hard quality to find in people's writing, because in a way there's a whole system of education and of like reification that excludes this type of writing, that wants you to say that you know things, that want you to like figure out what things are, that want you to have like questions that have answers, that this kind of like idea of neutrality in knowledge is just even though it has been, there's like a long tradition in lots of different traditions from like feminism or like queer theory or crip theory or black theory, that have like tried to dismantle that is still so much how we exist in the world. And if you're at university, that's how your lectures are. You are told things are, and they're supposed to be understood in a certain way, and they have certain meanings. And I just really, it's such a joy for me when I read something that doesn't believe, that it's not that doesn't believe in that, but finds ways to not have to give in. And I think to me, this text does that in this really lovely way.
So if partly we're thinking about how to read and how to help students read and how to help students get the best out of texts that they're passed on by their tutors. I'm like ramps to me is like a work that would be very helpful for certain students to know about, well, for lots of students to know about. And there's reviews you can read of it, there's pictures you can look at it. I can kind of see that as a reference being passed over fairly straightforwardly. But in an art school context, how would we pass over this kind of essay, which is very different and is written by an artist, but it never mentions art explicitly, and it's about things that are spatial and temporal, but is not explicitly about formal qualities of sculpture or anything like that. And yet for us in this discussion, we're talking about it in relation to those other things. So how do you think we as teachers or anyone passing on references to other people, how would you pass on this reference? How were you passed on this reference? What did the person who sent this essay to you say to you when they sent it?
I guess they sent it to me the same way that I would pass it on. They just say, I love this. You didn't get the exhibition, but I love this. You need to read this. And it's very funny. And again, like in terms of like different genealogies, I come from a genealogy, or like I come from like, a cultural context where like affect has a lot of value, and recognize intellectual value and recognize pedagogical value that you don't. So, and I think there's something really interesting to say, oh, you need to read this because this is important. You need to read this because this is canon. You need to read this because you need to know who Adorno is, or who Deleuze and how come you don't know Deleuze? You need to know Deleuze. And there's something really different to like receive something that is just like, it's like a gift. Someone is like, this makes me happy. I want you to read it because this makes me happy. And I just want you to find text that makes you happy. And then that becomes also like a personal thing, because maybe I give you something that I love and you don't love it, but you understand that is a way to relate.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we don't.
Okay.
I think like in a British pedagogical model, we don't talk about affects enough. We don't talk about like, love and in relation to text, to art, like love, disgust, hate. There's a real pleasure in me on my hate of Rosalind Krauss increasing through this thing, because there's also like a lot of understanding. Like it is an intellectual process of engagement with something that is not just...
Yeah, we talked about that in the Felida Barlow episode, right? Like dismissal as an active form of critical engagement, how she dismisses a whole generation of British sculptors by engaging with them quite deeply and then saying, this is rubbish, essentially.
It is an intellectual engagement to read Lucy Lippards, and then I was like, they can't be the same age. Like, how is this possible? Like Krauss has to be like 30 years older than Lippards. And then Googling and being like, oh my God, Krauss is actually younger than Lippards. How is that? And again, and
Because of the style, you mean, sorry. Is that what you mean? Or
the style
of the writing.
The kind of the need for authority and for, again, when Lippards is writing and you're reading like, oh my God, this art is happening when like the civil rights movement is happening, when Vietnam War is happening, Lippards is writing and she's writing about Black artists, which is something that Rosalind Krauss doesn't do in a very horrible way. And Lippards is saying like, oh my God, Adrian Piper was doing this thing and we're doing this thing together. Krauss is writing that in the same political context. How can you write something about the art that is happening during the civil rights movement and ignore Black artists? Like it takes a very specific type of person and produce a certain type of authority that redefines that absence. Like, so,
without defending Krauss, because she directly said things about Black art. She was very dismissive of Black art in public statements. But, people did, like the whole of the New York art world, the funded institutional art world did ignore lots and lots of Black artists. Adrian Piper was an exception, I think. I don't think that's unfair to say that Adrian, and that has a relation, that is in relation to her work and her approach to thinking about race. There's a complex relationship between, this is a whole kind of episode, but between the Black arts movement, and there was a real tension between different parts of the Black arts movement, right? So David Hammond's and the kind of more formal abstract artists were dismissed by a lot of people in the Black arts movement because their work was not deemed political enough, for example. So there was lots of like things going on. But the structural racism was such that, basically like lots of mainstream recollections of art made in the 60s just ignores most Black artists. And Lucy Lippards does it less, and she makes concerted effort, especially in those preface and late, the prefaces and intros because Lippards wrote later.
Again, like Lippards engages with, Latin American art. So Lippards goes to Argentina, and like one of the narrations of conceptual art is that conceptual art is heavily influenced by Latin America. Like Lippards is so thoughtful in how she places that work in relation to whatever is happening in the world. At the same time.
No, I completely agree about Lippards, and I completely agree about Krauss, but I just don't want us to get into this weird narrative that if Krauss hadn't been as dismissive of Black art, then somehow it would have been more present in institutions or something.
There is symptomatic of again, that sort of writing that needs to create one coherent narrative, and that coherent narrative have to be based on universality, and universality needs to exclude everything that is not normative to be able to exist. And that
absolutely.
is absolutely present in her writing, and that's what I find annoying about her writing. But it has been, what I'm trying to say is like my dislike of Krauss is not a disengagement, it's the opposite. Because now, reading Lippards, I have that text to come. Like there's something about, I know I listened to our first episode and we talk about Krauss' essay on part object part sculpture, and I also really dislike that essay. And it has been really interesting, like, because in a way, to be able to have this affective relationships as part of your intellectual practice, it does require like a certain sort of engagement to then understand your affects and kind of like work on them, or like being aware of those.
Yeah. So
sorry,
not to treat them as
that was
like-
my point for students and how you share those texts, and how do I think about this in terms of like a pedagogical. There's a way, I think, in I'm going to say British art school, but I don't know how this relates to other art schools in Europe, and I'm not really sure how it relates to British culture in general. But there's a way in which like affects and intellect are completely separate. So you can either have, so if you had a text like Park McArthur, a lot of times you will have something that is just about, your inner pain and how hard it is, and then you express that, and it's about a self-expression, and it's about feelings, and it doesn't. Or you have something that is very serious and policy-based and research and full of authority and something. And I think to me the interesting thing is like, why are these things separated, and how can we bring them together? And this text is just so full of love and affection and care, and but it is also full of like policy and politics, and is also full of sculpture and art and all these other things that there's something about bringing all these things together. And I think maybe that's how I would like introduce that's the sort of student that I would introduce. It's like I made this note because she has this thing at the first page when she says, through the fall of 2011 and the winter of 2012, I wrote in this journal almost daily. So regular was my need to record these initial experiences receiving care in this way. And I have so many students that do journaling and that write diaries. And it's really, really hard because they think that, or they want to have that as their main writing. It's like that can only have one place, which is it can be the thing itself, or it can be completely dismissed and be considered like a vacuous, non-intellectual, I don't know, well-being activity or something. And there's something really interesting because McCarthur like messes those things up, and is but she uses that to construct something else.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry for that one.
I was just thinking
forever.
no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think about as well, how to introduce work like McCarthur's to a student, which is not spectacular work in photographs or something. If there's not a show on, you can't send them to the show to get the feeling of what it's like in person. So in a way, this piece is really helpful because it helps you understand McCarthur's positioning, well, her position and her experiences that lead her to make the kind of work that she does. And that, and as you say, it's just a lovely text, and it's written by McCarthur, and it's very personal while also being very thorough and well researched and well worked over and over again. So in a way, like, it's a nice starting point to get into McCarthur's work as well. I suppose that's the other thing to say. Can I just follow that with something? Because she has this amazing bit, which is not on the interview that we just had 2 interviews. So it's on the other one.
It's in the other interview.
The Moose magazine. Okay, yeah.
I think, the Moose magazine. Maybe we can upload that as well. But there's a question about identity. And I thought it just connects to what you're saying about her experience. And there's something about the way she's kind of framing identity. So the question is, a lot of the show's reviews and other writing about your practice have a passage that says something along the lines of McCarthur, who is disabled and uses a wheelchair. Do you feel that this kind of qualification from writers overtly determines the interpretation of your work? Is it the equivalent of any of the myriad of other labels are ascribed to other artists, such as Black, queer, feminist, etc.? And then Park replies, just as Adrian Piper wouldn't have made Adrian Piper's work without being a Black philosopher in a white supremacist world, I wouldn't have made ramps if I didn't use a wheelchair in an ableist world. And I don't mean because of the fact that ramps are the wheelchair's counterpoints. I mean that the repeated administrative navigation required of people seeking access, where access is only ever tangential or conditional and is often reversible, is what amounts to a show like Ramps. This accumulated work is due to much more than to my use of a wheelchair, to the ways my class position, gender identity, and race provide me access. It less of a question of whether or not this one biographical fact overly determines my work. It is neither an over nor an under determination that question as to whether critics will ever credit the identity they call out. And I think that's a little bit is a long answer, but a little below she says, it's not that a label gets mapped onto an artist, but that without the work and struggle that amounts to a label, there would be no art. And I think it's just like a lovely way to understand how like identity or the positionality of an artist or the public or the viewer in relation to the work, that is not, it's not like that the identity is like this category, then you know, all the work that McCarthur does can only be understood in relation for that, you know, all her work she does is about this experience, but it's that we are the people that we are through the way we encounter the world, and that comes out in the work. And I think that's helpful for students to think about as well, because sometimes art school pressures people to like monetize certain parts of their identity, basically, or like focus on that, because sometimes as teachers, maybe we don't have the skills to deal with like certain experience of navigating the world, and you don't necessarily understand the work, and this is like an easy way out. And there's something really interesting about the way she flips that. So it's more about, again, it's like a refusal of neutrality. It's a call to, that's what I started with, talking about fatigue and how my brain is weird today, but it's a call to your own positionality, and don't feel that you have to like represent it in a way, but just that you work with the conditions of your life. Not to exploit them, sorry, that you work with them, that they're part of you, that you can't escape them.
Of course, yeah, like it's, of course, this always already phrase, which is a philosophical phrase, right? Like, yeah, you are always already working with those conditions. That's definitely important, isn't it? The one thing I would say, and this is just something to note because I'm just thinking about Andrea Fraser again. I was looking into Andrea Fraser partly because the way she talks about some of the work she made in the late 90s, these kind of institutional critique works, she frames them as coming from affects of resentment and envy, which are feelings that I'm really interested in exploring with my own work. But what I noted in some of my writing about Fraser was that what was so tricky in terms of my relationship with her was that she's just very charismatic, very intelligent, very articulate, and a very good writer. So that when she writes about her work coming from places of envy and resentment, she, you know, communicates that in a particular tone, if we use kind of Adam Smith's idea of like how to communicate resentment within democracy. Like she's just really good at communicating her envy and resentment without coming across as like, I guess, what are those negative terms, like whiny or annoying or jealous, or does that make sense? And I think there is something to be said here, is that Park McArthur, I don't know how, I've never seen her speak or anything, but in her writing she is very, very articulate and thorough and able to, you know, pass out these differences between, you know, the sort of identity tags that reduce a work of art to disabled art versus, you know, how her experience as a white, privileged, disabled, anyway, you know, we don't have to literally specify, but like how the experiences that come from that positionality have informed her work. But in a way, like, she does a really good job of distinguishing those, and they should be distinguished. By distinguishing them, she kind of dodges the question slightly, which is about, do you feel this kind of qualification from writers overly determines interpretation of your work? And I would say, yes, it does, right? Like, that's partly why it was a bit hard to find one text that we could read about Park McArthur, was because even in good texts, good interviews about Park McArthur, they quickly move on from like the materials of the work or the way the work looked in the space. Some, you know, there's lots of little bits across all the texts, but there is a lot more discussion, I suppose, about other, you know, the connections between multiple parts of her practice. I don't know. I'm getting a bit mixed up now, and this is exactly the problem I'm talking about.
But see, I connected that difficulty of writing about her work more to this kind of weird, like, variation of the ready-made she uses, because when it comes to the work, there's a lot of work that I objectively don't find that interesting, or like I think Ramp to me is one of the most visually engaging of all her works. But she has she has this work, I don't remember which one of the interviews is, but she kind of like closes the gallery and then she kind of like, in theory, moves it to somewhere else, and then what is there in an address, and it's pointing, and there's like a clothesline where she kind of hangs different clothes on different days. And I think it's hard for me to engage with that work materially because so much of it is about, again, the conceptual action. And this is what the conceptualism thing is interesting, right? Because there's like I'm not gonna find it right now, but there's like a good definition of conceptualism on the Lucy Lippards, and it's something about how the materiality of the work is less important than the sort of like the ideas that the work is presenting or making come into being. And I think
here it is. Conceptual art for me means work in which the idea is paramount and the material form is secondary.
Yeah, that's it. When we were thinking about this episode, the idea was we were going to do Park McArthur and Caroline Lazard, which we had exactly the same problem in terms of texts. And then we decided not to. But looking at Caroline Lazard, I feel the same, right? Because she'll get like an object that exists in the world and she should put it in the gallery. And it's hard to talk about the material qualities of the object for a certain point because, yes, there is an object and yes, it has a sculptural quality, but it also is doing all these other things, and the interesting thing happens there in that tension.
No, that's totally right. And that tension is in the overdetermination of the work as quote unquote, it's like the work of a disabled artist or something. So like part of the institutional critique is in the tension between the necessity of identity forming experiences that help you produce that work and the tendency of art world criticism to overdetermine that work as only disabled or only about sickness or ill health or something.
And I think that's where like it was hard, but I think the interesting, and we did find another like 2 or 3 texts on it, but they were like really short. But I think the interesting writing about it happens when people are looking at they sort of like step away from a bit like the death of the artist. They stepped a little bit away from McCarthur's biography and they focus more on, what the object does in terms of like, or what her work does in terms of making visible the social reproduction of the work, making visible the maintenance of the work, making visible, this absence that happens. Or in the Afterall, there's this, and I think in one of the other texts that we can put a secondary reading, but when they're talking about the sound piece that she made, which had this kind of like two big blocks of foam that kind of like created like a silence in the middle. And there's a lot of like really interesting analysis of the works there where you kind of like, where the writer, manages to step away from the identity of Park McArthur and kind of like focuses on what the work is doing on space. Like those are definitely the most interesting pieces of writing, but it's hard in the art world, I think, to make the space for the writing to be just that.
But the work is more than just that. And like, there's a dialectic here or whatever it is. There's a contradiction here that's really, really important that shouldn't be ignored. I mean, what's funny actually is that work that you're talking about, which is called During the Month of August, Essex Street Will Be Closed from 2013. They then re-showed the clothes as individual sculptures. And there's an image of that later on in the Afterall text. And that's my favourite Park McArthur work as a sculpture. Now I also know about her practice more generally, but like in terms of if I walked into a gallery, I would love to see that on a wall. So there's, there's also issues around like how the work is displayed originally, where it's like hanging outside a gallery and the gallery's closed and there's not, the framing is very different to when it's then put on a white wall and displayed as a, individual sculpture or something, and suddenly it's like, oh, actually there's loads of sculptural stuff in that going on that I just really enjoy on its own terms or something.
But I think that's really interesting, right? Because that's why I just have the 2 images here and they're both on the Afterall. So because when you look at the clothes on the clothesline, they're not framed, right? Like it's like the kind of like this tension between the conceptual and the sculptural. Here is just completely to the conceptual.
Yeah, definitely.
I would say.
So Andrea's holding up the original image, which is a closed-looking, shuttered-up building. I mean, we won't go into the details of the work. It's very complex work. But there's on a chain hanging outside. There's clothes hanging up, but in a quite standard way, like they're hanging on the chain in a line. Whereas,
if you were passing by and no one told you there was an artwork, you'd be like, "Huh, that's just like urban."
Yeah.
That's just like stuff that you see in a big city in an urban landscape. And then the other photo, which is the photo that Matt
Oh no, I'm not looking at that one. I'm
No?
looking at the one on the page before, which is the exact same work reinstalled. That one, yeah, because that's the same work reinstalled.
So in that scale, this has moved very, very far away from the conceptual and embraced the sculptural, right?
Yeah, but it's this, you know, and McCarthur is stating that it's the same work, it has the same title, but it's been reformatted for a gallery presentation. And I think this is where we get into this thing of like, you know, sculptural practice in the 21st century is just obviously, for obvious reasons, takes many more forms and is multi-layered in a way that when we're looking back at whatever minimalism or something, it's much easier to look at one version of the work and be like, oh yeah, that's the work. But, you know, because it's Park McArthur's work is being historicized now and she's still producing work now, you know, we're seeing these multiple iterations, and, you know, her writing is just as present as her sculptural works, just as present as her publications and performances and sound works, etc. So we don't have this kind of neatly historicized version. So that's not just about her being an artist who makes work from a position of being disabled, but it's about her being an artist in the 21st century who's working in lots of different ways, and history hasn't decided which one of those ways. You know, it's not like sculptor Park McArthur, is it? It's like artist Park McArthur, which is one of those things,
but
which may or may not be decided by history.
Like, I just want to keep my optimism that I think that sort of neat historization, it's over, and that we're not going to have it, and that we're going to live, and that's in a way, you know, involving to like is what a lot of the fights for like decolonization and kind of like rethinking all these different processes exist, that we're not going to have a reification process where like one, you know, collector, one museum is going to decide, oh, actually this is how Park McArthur exists in history, and then and narrow it. That I'm hoping that as time moves on, we'll live with more narratives, like Lucy Lippards narratives, like and I think that's kind of our role at university as well, is to create people that can navigate a world when there is no one neat history.
I mean, that's what I do wonder, you know, in terms of the institution of. That's why I asked about how would you recommend the sort of like a hug piece, because I do wonder whether we get enough time with students individually or something. I don't know. I mean, I'm interested to, you know, we can talk about this later about maybe you will recommend this text to people and yes, track how it operates within that student's work over the next few years, but you won't, because you won't teach them next year because they'll go into year 3 or whatever it is. I think what I mean is that it takes time to get with these kind of practices, right? You know, we're experienced at doing this now because we're interested in reading about artworks, and we've done this podcast which is really focused us in about how to get to grips with an artist's practice through text. And even for us in this podcast, I can feel it's a very different kind of podcast that I'm really enjoying. But yeah, is that possible within like the contextual research section of a student's submission for like module 1 of unit 2 or whatever it is? I
mean, yes, we need to like completely rethink what our school does. I'm like, revolution, 100%, right? Because like, I think
I'm just like, we should just decide that Park McArthur is a sculptor, and then that would make it much easier for students to reference them. Yeah.
I'm like, no, we need to rethink how art school works and what it does. But I think it's and I'm fully invested in that. You know, that's one of the things that I'm doing at uni, is like I'm fully invested in rethinking how we teach writing and how we teach reading through the 3 years. But I think that's what's exciting about McCarthur's writing as well, because she's just like making the kind of the structural challenges visible. And what you're saying is that when we don't have that much time with students, it's like, yes, it's really easy to teach a neat history. It's really easy to do a lecture and just say, this is minimalism, this is Donald Judd, this is Robert Morris, got it? And Dan Flavin. And this is what minimalism was, and let's move on. And it's really hard to be like, well, actually, you know, there was this performance, actually, Chicago did minimalism, also Adrian Piper, also, have you thought about, and for that to happen, we need to have more time wasted. You know, I mean, I think it's super interesting because the idea is that the next episode is about sculpture as an art pedagogy. It's like a sculpture pedagogy inside art school. So maybe this is a good connection, but we're gonna look at some like historical examples of our colleges and And what you had there, first of all, is that you have so much more time. Like, staff had so much more time. There were so less students, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. Maybe it's good that we have a lot of students, but that those, and this is the McCarthur connection, it's like those structural conditions of access have not been rethought in these new conditions of distribution. And for you to be able to develop certain things, these two things have to be thought together. So yes, revolution, 100%. That's my solution.
Let's leave it at that. Revolution is the solution. All right. Thanks to Andrea for taking part in that conversation. Thanks to you for listening. Next time we'll be speaking, as Andrea mentioned, about sculptural pedagogy or sculpture in the art school. See you next time.